At first, it sounds almost absurd. A handful of poor warrior monks, sworn to poverty, sleeping in rough quarters, wearing plain mantles, speaking the language of sacrifice and service, somehow becoming so powerful that kings borrowed from them. Kings. Men who claimed their authority came from God, who commanded armies, collected taxes, and bent whole regions to their will. And yet, for a time, even they seemed to circle this brotherhood with a strange mixture of admiration, dependence, and unease. You hear the name Knights Templar, and the imagination usually rushes ahead of the facts. Secret rites, hidden treasure, whispered conspiracies, the sort of material that clings to history when the real story is already unsettling enough. Because the truly uncomfortable question is not whether the Templars hid some grand secret under a chapel floor or carried away relics in the night. It is something quieter than that, something more structural. How did an order of men who officially owned nothing build a machine that seemed to touch everything? And maybe that is where the unease begins. Not in the myths that came later, but in the contradiction that existed from the start. They were monks, but they fought. They were poor, but they handled wealth. They were supposed to serve Christendom, but they gradually became one of its most efficient institutions, moving above borders in a world where almost everything else was trapped inside them. You might start to wonder whether medieval kings feared the Templars for what they knew, or for what they had proven was possible. Because once you strip away the romance, what begins to emerge is less like a chivalric tale and more like an investigation into power itself. Not the loud kind of power, with crowns and banners and men shouting in halls of stone, something colder, more durable. A power built through trust, obedience, exemptions, records, roots, fortresses, and a reputation so carefully maintained that people handed over land, coin, and confidence with almost devotional instinct. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. What makes this story linger is that the Templars did not simply become rich or famous or militarily useful. Plenty of groups managed one or two of those things. The Templars became difficult to place. They were not a kingdom, but they could rival kingdoms in reach. Not exactly merchants, though they moved wealth with unnerving skill. Not just holy men, despite the prayers. Not merely soldiers, despite the swords. And when an institution becomes hard to classify, people tend to do one of two things. They sanctify it, or they destroy it. The Templars, in time, would experience both. But that comes later. First, you have to go back to the beginning, to the carefully cultivated image of humility, and ask whether poverty ever meant what it seemed to mean. The Templars liked to be seen at the beginning as men of almost embarrassing simplicity, not grand lords, not polished courtiers, just a few hardened brothers, roughened by war and faith, offering their lives to protect pilgrims in a land that seemed to swallow the careless whole. It is an image that still works, even now. You can feel why people believed in it. A brotherhood stripped down to essentials, no luxury, no vanity, no distractions, just devotion sharpened into service. And yet, that image deserves a longer look. Because poverty in medieval Europe was never always just poverty. Sometimes it was theater. Or maybe that is too cynical. Let's say it was a language, a way of presenting moral seriousness so convincingly that powerful people wanted to be associated with it. The early Templars may indeed have lived austerely by the standards of noble society. Their rule pushed restraint, obedience, plainness. But the story becomes more complicated the moment you notice who stood near them almost from the start. They were poor men, yes. Poor men with unusually powerful friends. That difference matters. It is one thing for a few devout knights to make private vows and disappear into the dust of the eastern roads. It is another for those same men to receive recognition, protection, and endorsement from some of the most influential currents in Latin Christendom. Suddenly, poverty stops looking like weakness. It begins to look like credibility, a kind of moral capital. The less they seemed to want for themselves, the easier it became for others to justify giving them everything. You can almost hear the appeal, Here was an age obsessed with sin, salvation, violence, and status. And into that mess stepped an order that seemed to promise purification through discipline. Noblemen who had spent their lives bathed in blood and inheritance could look at the Templars and see something redemptive. Not because the order rejected power entirely, but because it appeared to submit power to a holier purpose. That is always attractive. Dangerous too, maybe, but attractive first. Still, something about the early image does not sit neatly. The famous ideal of the poor warrior monk has a way of flattening the fact that institutions do not rise on sincerity alone. They rise because someone opens doors, someone speaks for them in rooms they cannot enter themselves. Someone says, "These men matter, protect them, fund them, legitimize them." And once that happens, humility becomes less an obstacle than an advantage. The Templars did not need to look rich to gather resources. In some ways, looking poor made the transfer of wealth easier, even virtuous. That is the irony at the heart of their beginning. Their poverty made them persuasive. A lord donating land to a luxurious court might feel he was feeding appetite. A lord donating land to a brotherhood of disciplined defenders could imagine he was investing in heaven, the same estate, the same revenue, the same political effect, but morally transformed by the identity of the recipient. And the Templars understood identity with remarkable precision, even if they did not yet fully understand where it would take them. Or perhaps they did. It is hard to tell with founders. Later generations tend to project genius backward, as if every outcome had been planned from the first whispered conversation. Maybe the earliest brothers were simply improvising inside a world hungry for symbols. But even improvisation can harden into strategy once people notice what works. And what worked was this. The Templars came wrapped in contradiction that flattered everyone who touched them. They were warriors, which appealed to the knightly class. They were monks, which reassured the church. They were poor, which made them morally luminous. They were useful, which made them politically valuable. Few institutions ever arrive carrying so many advantages disguised as burdens. You start to wonder whether their early humility was misunderstood, not because it was false, but because it was incomplete. A vow of poverty does not mean an institution cannot accumulate wealth around itself. It only means the individual brother owns nothing personally. That distinction sounds narrow until you realize how much can fit inside it. A man may sleep on a straw mattress and eat from a plain bowl, while the order he serves acquires estates, mills, rents, ports, barns, horses,